Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little. I'm a professional poker player with over 6.5 million in live tournament earnings, as well as the author of 14 best-selling educational poker books. And by far the most common question I get is how do I know when I should continuation bet and how much should I continuation bet? And in this short video, I'm going to give you 3 questions to ask yourself in order to determine the answer to this. So the first question is, does your opponent have obvious flaws in their strategy? Second, do you have a range advantage? And third, where does your hand fall in the 4 hand categories? And this presentation is going to deal specifically with when you are the pre-flop raiser and you're in position and your opponent checks to you, which is the most common scenario you're going to be in if you play a good, solid, tight, aggressive strategy. But it also applies to all the other scenarios as well, just ranges will be a little bit different. So, first, does your opponent have obvious flaws in their strategy? If your opponent makes obvious mistakes, you should exploit them. So probably the most common flaw you're going to find your opponents have is that they're going to call too often pre-flop with a wide range of garbage, and then they're going to check fold a lot of it on the flop. And if that's the case, you should continuation bet almost every time. This strategy was very, very useful for me 5 or 6 years ago, even at the very high stakes games where people would call a lot pre-flop and then just check fold when they didn't have a pair or better. And imagine you know that on a random board, your opponent's going to make a pair or a draw or something like that about 40% of the time. Whenever you're determining how often your opponent will fold, you take 100% and then subtract the percentage of the time that they're going to call. So if they're going to call 40%, that means they're going to fold 60% of the time to a bet. So when determining how often a complete bluff with no equity needs to succeed, usually you'll have some equity in no limit hold'em. Like let's say you have king 5 and the flop comes jack 7-3. Well, if you get a king on the turn, it's probably good, right? The way you determine if a complete bluff is profitable, you take your bet and divide it by the pot size plus your bet. So let's say the pot's 100 and we decide to bet 100. We're making a pot size bet. If we pick up this pot more than 50% of the time, our bluffs are going to be immediately profitable, which is great. So, like I just said, if people are folding when they don't have anything, which is going to be about 60% of the time, well, 60% is more than 50%, and you're just going to print money because they need to defend 50% and they're only going to defend 40%. Let's instead suppose you bet even smaller, like 1/3 pot. Let's say the pot's $100 and you bet $30. In that spot, you take 0.3, 30%, divided by 1 plus 0.3, which is 1.3, and that is 23%. So in this situation, if your opponent folds 23% of the time or more, you're going to immediately profit with all of your bluffs. And obviously, like I said, your bluffs still have some equity, so even then you'll outdraw whatever your opponent decides to call you with. And you will typically find that most people do not defend nearly often enough against continuation bets, especially in the small and medium stakes games. And if they do defend with a wide range, very often their range is too weak to defend on the later streets. So continuation betting frequently is often a very good strategy against most recreational players. But some people have other flaws, and you'll find that some people almost never fold. They legitimately always check call or check raise. And against these players, instead of continuation betting with everything, you want to bet wider for value, but with almost none of your bluffs. And that's because you're going to get called. And if you're going to get called and your opponent's just a calling station, you don't want to bluff as much, but instead you can start value betting bottom pair or maybe even ace high. So that's a good adjustment against those players. If your opponents will often bet the turn if the flop checks through, this is going to be against players who are generally aggressive and they attack weakness, you should consider checking behind on the flop with hands like top pair because they're just going to bet the turn and you're going to snap off a lot of bluffs. So there are many, many things your opponents can do wrong. These are probably 3 of the most common that you will see your opponents the wrong plays you'll see your opponents making. And don't be afraid just to get well out of line and take advantage of them. So let's assume we don't know what our opponent's going to do wrong or your opponent's just a good player. Now we're going to try to develop a game theory optimal strategy on our end, on the fly, somewhat quickly. What you want to do is you want to ask yourself, do I have a range advantage? And you can figure this out by using a program called Equilab. You just run your whole preflop range against your opponent's whole preflop range on whatever board you're looking at, and you'll see if you have a range advantage. So if your range has a significant advantage over your opponent's, you should usually continuation bet small with all or almost all of your range. So as an example, let's say you raise from early position with a strong range, right? Because you're raising good hands from early position. And the big blind calls with a wide range. The flop comes ace, queen, 3. If you run this through Equilab, you'll see that you have 64% equity with your range. Now, obviously, your opponent's going to fold out all of their garbage, so if you bet with everything, that's going to get closer to 50-50. But this is a spot where you have a huge range advantage, and so you should bet very small and often. And a small bet is usually going to be something like 1/3 pot, not a big bet. You don't have to be blasting it. When you blast it, what happens is your opponents will start folding out all of their garbage, and you don't really care if your opponents stick around with garbage, because imagine they called with everything, right? As you see here, that's fine because you have 64% equity. They're giving you an edge whenever they call. If your range does not have a significant advantage over your opponents, you should continuation bet large and less frequently, depending on where your hand falls in the 4 hand categories, which we're going to look at in just a second. So let's say again you raise from early position with a strong range and the big blind calls with a wide range, but this time it comes 8-7-6. If you run this through Equilab, you'll see that you have 53% now as opposed to 64%, which is not nearly as much, right? So when you have a tiny advantage or no advantage, you often want to bet large and infrequently. And a large bet here would be something like 3/4 pot or pot. So when you have a significant advantage, you want to bet often and small. And when you don't have a significant advantage, you want to bet less frequently, but usually larger. And as another general tip, as the board becomes more draw heavy, you typically want to bet a little bit larger as well. That's because there is value in extracting value from the draws, right? And also, you don't really care if your opponent folds out stuff like a gut shot, especially if you're not going to see that gut shot. All right, so let's say we've now determined we don't want to bet frequently because we don't have a range advantage, or we don't have a big range advantage. Next, you want to ask, where does your hand fall in the 4 hand categories? And on the flop, you will either have a premium made hand. These are going to be top pair, strong kickers, and better. These are just like really good hands that you can bet with on all 3 streets. You're going to have a draw. These are, straight flush draws all the way down to gut shots or maybe even an overcard. Next, you're going to have marginal made hands. These are going to be top pair, perhaps down to decent ace highs. These are hands that, you can maybe bet once and get called or maybe even twice and get called, but you really don't want to bet the flop, the turn, and the river because if your opponent sticks around for all 3 streets, they probably have, let's say, bottom pair beat, right? And then you have junk, which is just complete garbage. Like say you have 8-7 of clubs and it comes ace, queen, 4. No clubs. You just have nothing, right? That's just complete garbage. So typically, what you want to do is you want to be betting with your premium made hands and your draws, and you want to check with your marginal made hands and your junk. So playing in this manner does not make your bets or checks obviously strong or weak. And this is going to make you really, really difficult to play against. Anytime you take any action that is obviously strong or weak, you make it to where your opponents will be able to make good decisions against you. So this happens very frequently when, let's say, a really, really tight player raises, and you just know they have aces, kings, queens, or ace, king. Well, what do? You only call with implied odds hands, and you just never, ever get your money in with something like ace, king, or pocket jacks, right? Because you're completely crushed. So you never want to make your opponent's decisions simple. And you do this by not making your bets or checks obviously strong or weak. I mean, one of the most common errors you see amateur players make is they'll raise pre-flop and then they'll check behind on the flop with something like ace high and worse, and they'll bet everything better than ace high. So when it goes check, check on the flop, their opponents know they can just bet the turn and their opponent's going to fold almost every time. And that makes their life really, really easy. Remember, you make money when your opponents make mistakes, not when they play well. And they will make mistakes if they don't know what you have. So let's take a look at an example here. Let's say you raise from middle position and the big blind calls. Flop comes 9 of hearts, 7 of hearts, 3 of clubs. If you run this through Equilab, you will see you do not have a range advantage. And you're going to find you usually don't have a range advantage as the pre-flop raiser on middle card boards or usually very coordinated boards, unless the coordinated cards are all very high cards. So on 9-7-3, you are definitely not going to want to continuation bet 100% of the time against a good player. What you want to do is you want to look at how all the hands in your range fit in with this general strategy. So as you see here, we have the premium made hands in red, which you should bet. We have the draws in blue, which you should bet. We have the marginal made hands in green, which you should check, and we have the junk in gray, which you should also check. So let's just go through these really quick and make sure everything looks logical. So premium made hands, we have overpairs, sets, two pairs, and then ace nine and king nine. These are all really good hands, right? Top pair, good kicker, and better. Makes a lot of sense to bet those. What are our draws? Well, we have the flush draws. I'm not sure if you can see it on this video, but we have the hearts and clubs for these suited hands. The hearts are flush draws immediately, and the clubs are backdoor flush draws. If you only bet with your good draws, by the way, you're going to have way too much junk in your range, and that's going to make you easy to play against because you just don't have very many bluffs, right? We also are betting with hands with a straight draw as a bluff, 10-8 and 6-5. We're also betting a few of these random overcard hands that have no showdown value as a bluff. That's going to be Queen Jack, King 10 suited, Queen 10 suited, and Jack 10 suited. By betting those, it's going to make it to where your opponents have a tough time whenever, like say a random queen comes, you could just have the queen sometimes, and that makes things difficult for them. We're also betting ace-8 suiteds as well, and that's just because they're going to get a gut shot straight draw on the turn a lot of the time when a 10, a jack, a 6, or 5 comes. Also, the ace is randomly good. So these are all of our draws. In general, on the flop, you want to have something between a 2-to-1 and a 1-to-1 ratio bluffs to draws, depending on how deep stacked you are. And here, as you see, we have about a 1.25 to 1 or 1.3 to 1 ratio between draws and premium made hands. You take 25% divided by 18%, that's going to give you the rough ratio. So it's somewhere between 2-to-1 and 1-to-1. I typically like to have as many bluffs as possible in my range, just because that's going to allow you to bet more often. And typically, I think you do want to skew towards bluffing a little bit too often, unless your opponents are great. And again, this strategy is designed to be against great players, so maybe you want to tone it down a bit, like we have here. Next, marginal made hands. What are those? Well, those are some of your top pairs, down to 9-8. Also pocket eights, pocket 6s, 5s, 4s, and 2s. Ace-7 suited for middle pair. And then I also have ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, and ace-10 that don't have the flush draws. So these are hands that can very often check behind on the flop and then usually call a turn bet and see what develops on the river. Remember, you do not want to have no top pairs or middle pairs in this range, because if you bet all of your top pairs and middle pairs on the flop, well, when you check, what does it do? It makes your checking range very, very weak. And if your checking range is very, very weak, your opponents will just be able to bet and make you fold. And that's not good. You want to make sure your checking range is protected by having some good hands in it. Given this board's very coordinated, you may think in general you want to slow play stuff like sets, but on coordinated boards, that's particularly dangerous because say a random jack comes on the turn. Well, maybe you just let your opponent outdraw you, right? Whenever you're slow playing, you want to slow play hands that can't really get outdrawn. And here, even sets can get outdrawn. So I'm not a big fan of slow playing much here. You may want to check back with something like aces or kings occasionally because those aren't very susceptible to getting outdrawn. And you know you're not going to try to value raise with those hands if your opponent bets the turn and then bets the river. So maybe those hands make some sense to check behind if you want to make your checking range stronger, because let's say you know your opponent's going to be bluffing the turn a lot. But I think this checking range is already pretty decent. Notice on the turn, we're just always going to call with any pair. The ace highs will sometimes make top pair, which can easily continue. And if you look at our junk, that's just king, queen, king, jack. And these hands also have some equity to improve. So those are hands you likely want to check behind, and then if you don't improve, just fold on the turn if your opponent bets. And as you can see, given the marginal made range is quite big, 42% compared to the 14% of junk, that's going to allow you to call on the turn very frequently and then call on the river somewhat frequently as well. And that's going to make your checks not obviously weak. So this is how you would go about breaking down a range in a spot where you don't have a range advantage to determine what a good strategy is. When I initially broke this range down, by the way, I didn't have enough draws. I had a little bit too much junk because I was checking queen jack and queen 10 and king 10. And what happened there is my junk was too high, meaning I'm going to fold too often on the turn and the river. And also I didn't have enough draws in my range, meaning when I bet the flop, my range was too strong, allowing my opponent to easily fold. So you have to tinker with your range a bit. And this is why it's very important to work on your game away from the table so that you know in these situations how to play all of these various hands. It's really hard to come up with the perfectly right answer on the fly, but if you study away from the table, you'll have at least some idea of what you should be doing. And I actually have a training site, pokercoaching.com, where each month I present a homework question, very similar to what I just showed you, except for we go into turn and river play, and also we discuss pre-flop 3-betting and 4-betting and playing out of position and whatnot, where I challenge my students to go through and tell me how they're going to play their whole range. A lot of people ask, a lot of recreational players ask, how do I play my draws? Or how do I play my top pairs? Or how do I play pocket jacks? And usually that is not the right answer. You want to be asking, how do you play your whole range? And by thinking like that, you're going to cover all spots, all scenarios you're going to be in. And if you study that a lot away from the table, you will be much better prepared than your opponents. So anyway, you can sign up for a completely free 7-day trial to pokercoaching.com. Go there, go through all of the past homework questions. I also have a ton of quizzes there where you can test yourself and see how I think about the strategies you decide to choose at the table. And you're going to get better at poker. Go through there, use it for 7 days. If you don't like it, cancel it. I'm happy with that. I just want you all to get better at poker, and I think this is by far the best way to learn that is available. So check it out at pokercoaching.com. I hope you learned a lot in this video. If you did, leave comments wherever you're watching it, and I will talk to you next time.